If Paladins were to have a fourth spec, without a doubt it would be a Shockedin, although I would call it an Avenger spec. This is the spec that many Paladins have wanted for a long time. There is a lot that they can borrow from the other specs, simply to give Paladins a ranged DPS option. First of all, they could use Judgment to generate Holy Power just as Retribution and Protection do. They could also borrow Holy Shock as another means of generating Holy Power. As a Holy Power consuming spell, I would want a unique new ability called Divine Hammer. The idea here is that you throw a hammer of light at your target, which actually travels through them and past them for 10 yards, and then it returns to you, kinda like a boomerang effect. Positioning would be crucial to maximizing the damage done, especially in AoE situations, so the Avenger would only need one damaging finisher, but how they used it would be on the forefront of their mind. Now, the hammer would deal damage both on the way out and on the way back, meaning that you'd have to make sure that you position yourself accordingly if you wanted to hit the same target twice, or if you wanted to hit multiple targets. Hitting 3 or more targets would generate Holy Power. This would make up for the lack of a Holy Power generating AoE ability. They could take Inquisition from Retribution to give them something to manage. With Judgment and Holy Shock's cooldowns being so long, Sanctity of Battle could also be altered to reduce the cooldown of Holy Shock for the Avenger spec. They would need a filler cast time ability, especially as a ranged DPS, to ensure that there's something for the opponent to interrupt. This could function similar to how Mind Flay does for a Shadow Priest, being a channeled spell that does ticks of damage. Holy Power generation would always be the priority for an Avenger, so as soon as Holy Power generating abilities became available, they would interrupt their own filler in order to use it. Consecration is another ability that they could borrow and utilize, but not as a filler and only used when multiple targets are available. The current Consecration glyph would be especially useful for a ranged DPS. Crusader Strike might simply need to be removed from this spec, or the Holy Power generation associated with it. An Avenger's Mastery could really work off the idea of effectively using Divine Hammer, adding a periodic damage effect to every target that they hit with Divine Hammer. A unique utility ability that I think would serve an Avenger well would be Pillar of Light. Rogues already have a line of sight mechanic with Smoke Bomb, so I don't think that this would be impossible to implement. But it would provide another positioning element to the game, which could be used in a variety of circumstances, not only offensively to deal damage, but a great way to avoid CC or to counter some lethal knockbacks. As far as DPS cooldowns, Guardian of Ancient Kings that Retribution uses and Avenging Wrath would more than likely be sufficient, although Guardian of Ancient Kings would need to be modified for ranged DPS. The talents for Paladins are already designed with 3 roles in mind, and have very little in the way of range restriction, so they really wouldn't require any modification. Intellect Plate would have at least one more spec to go toward, although I already have it in my mind that a 4th spec for a Death Knight would use it as well. As the only item type currently utilized by one spec, anything would help. So that's my take on a 4th spec for Paladins. It would keep most of the feel of its melee counterparts, while still giving the spec some unique aspects to deal with.